All right, hello everyone. This is a lecture for Thursday, November, I think it's going to be November 12th. Recording this on Wednesday. But at any rate, this is on chapter 18. Okay, this is sort of an introduction to infectious diseases. So the first thing we should talk about is what is the definition of disease? And how is an infectious disease different than other diseases? So a disease is a disturbance in the normal functioning of an organism, right? So something is going physiologically wrong with the organism. And this is not due to physical damage. This is due to the actions of some kind of disorder, physiological disorder. So an infectious disease is caused by a microorganism. And by infectious, we mean it can be transmitted from host to host. So this could be because of viruses, as all these examples are. Could be because of bacteria. Could be because of parasites of some kind, unicellular, eukaryotic microbes, etc. Right? A non-infectious disease, in contrast, is not something that's transmissible from one organism to another. So this would be something like cancer, which is due to genetic mutations. It could be diabetes, which has to do with physiological damage to particular organs in the body that have long-term consequences, or asthma, things like allergic reactions, hereditary diseases, again, that have genetic basis, right? So these are not caused by the action of a microorganism, and therefore one person cannot infect another one with this disease. Now, there are some gray areas. There are, for example, certain types of cancer which have been linked to particular viruses or to particular bacteria, for example. And we'll maybe get into those later on. But, you know, HPV and cervical cancer would be one example. Helicobacter and gastric carcinomas would be another example, right? So these are cancers which have their roots in underlying infections or inflammatory processes that have sort of laid the groundwork for the mutations that give rise to the cancer. Those are sort of special cases. Usually it's a pretty clear distinction between an infectious disease and a non-infectious disease. But there's always mysteries and gray areas. Diseases have been with us since humans evolved because they are processes that affect all of life. Even if you're unicellular life, like bacteria, you can have bacteriophage that infect you, right? So humans have been suffering this since they evolved as higher primates and before that in their evolutionary history. Right, but there are some diseases which have arisen during, historical time or during recorded history. At any rate, this has been a problem forever. Some of the more dramatic examples have happened, during our, recorded Western or Eastern history. Right, so like bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, the Black Plague, Black Death, caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Right, this was talked about in chapter 1. The European colonists coming to the Americas and bringing diseases like smallpox and some other indigenous diseases to the indigenous population that did not have pre-existing immunity or had not developed immunity because they had not grown up in the presence of those pathogens, right? So the consequences were devastating. Of course, the global pandemic, the last global, well, maybe I shouldn't call it the last global pandemic, but influenza 100 years ago And of course, now we're living in the midst of a global pandemic with COVID-19. And in between there was HIV. So yeah, diseases have had impacts on humans for a long time. You can see though that as a general trend in the United States, for example, the death rate due to infectious diseases has dropped dramatically in the last 100, 120 years. Actually, most of that drop was between 1900 and 1960, as you see here, with this enormous spike for the influenza pandemic. Not surprisingly, as infectious disease causes of death declined, the average life expectancy increased, with the caveat again here that there was a dip there during the influenza pandemic. Right. So I think we actually talked about in the very first class, and if we didn't, we can talk about this more, what the causes of this were. I think we talked about that. Just throwing ideas out there, usually people will say, oh, antibiotics and vaccines. And that's true, they are very important, but they really didn't kick in until, 1930s and 40s and afterwards. So a lot of the progress was made before that, and that has to do mostly with sanitation and hygiene in urban environments where infectious diseases spread the fastest. Oh, there we go. But this slide is actually talking about what's happening now, not what's happened historically. So despite advances in vaccinations, antibiotics, sanitation, medical care, infectious diseases are still significant, especially outside of the affluent countries that fortunately the United States is part of. Europe, Australia, Japan, other countries of the world are still more middle income or lower income, have higher rates of infectious diseases, right? What this is showing is the differences in disease rates depending on age. And what you see is that for a lot of diseases, children are the most susceptible, but let's see, make sure I'm getting this right. But then for other diseases like HIV, for example, older adults are the ones that are more susceptible. Diarrheal diseases, children are more susceptible. This is showing also the first column is 1998, the next column is 2008. Some diseases have actually increased in frequency, some have decreased in frequency. So, we haven't solved all of these problems yet, but in some cases we're doing a good job, in other cases we still have a lot to work on. I should also point out here that the diseases for which there's the biggest difference that children are most susceptible to are also the ones that vaccines are most important for. That's why as children we get lots and lots of vaccinations, and that's a topic we're going to be talking about more next week. All right. Pathogen. A pathogen is a microbe that is frequently associated with disease, right? So pathogenesis is the process or the mechanism that a microbe uses to cause that disease state. These are just a bunch of terms that we want to be fairly clear on. Infection refers to the establishment and replication of a pathogen in its host, okay? So pathogenesis is sort of the overall mechanism that a microbe uses to cause the disease state. Infection is really sort of the early stages of the establishment of the pathogen in its host. And there are specific signs and symptoms associated with specific diseases that allow us to distinguish them, usually, right? But there are diseases that can have more than one cause. with basically the same signs and symptoms, or the signs and symptoms can be very subtly different between them. So this is just an example down here of what the signs and symptoms are of specific infectious diseases. Now, I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between signs and symptoms. We're focused on the microbiology here, not the medicine, right? Not the clinical, all the clinical aspects of it. We're most interested in what's going on with these causes and how, or these causes and what they're specifically doing. All right. All right. So a term that I do want you to remember is a primary pathogen versus an opportunistic pathogen. A primary pathogen is nearly always associated with the disease. An opportunistic pathogen is a microbe that is very often present in the human body, for example, and has, or outside of the body, and has a normal function outside of the body, but under certain conditions that can cause disease, right? So you don't want to have Bacillus anthracis growing in your body because it's very likely to be associated with the disease, right? But there are other bacteria that are much more normal components of the body. That actually gets back to the concept of commensals and symbionts, or commensals at least, from chapter 17. So a commensal is living in association with the body, not causing any damage to it, and may even be providing some benefit. If there's a sort of mutually beneficial relationship between host and microbe, then we would call that a symbiotic relationship. If there is a neutral relationship, or one is benefiting but the other isn't being hurt, then we would call that a commensal relationship. But if there is a dysfunction being caused, a disease state being caused, that's when we start talking about pathogens. So an opportunistic pathogen under certain conditions is causing disease. Another term to remember is virulence. So virulence is basically a way of measuring the severity of disease a pathogen induces. Now, another term that you will see used many times in the next week or two is the term virulence factor. Okay, a virulence factor is a trait of the pathogen that is important for causing disease. And we usually may add another caveat to that, but is not important outside of the host. So virulence factors are things like toxins, for example. Hopefully you guys can all see that. Toxins, antibiotic resistance might be an important virulence factor. What else? The ability to acquire iron inside the host, etc. So something that's used in the context of the host and causing disease, but is not otherwise important, right? And chapter 18 actually goes through a little discussion of that, is how you demonstrate whether something's a virulence factor. So how do you measure virulence? One way that's talked about in the book is the case to infection ratio. So the proportion of infected individuals who actually develop the signs and symptoms of disease, right? That's one way of looking at it. There are other ways of looking at it too, but another way of looking at virulence is the intensity of the symptoms of the disease. Another way of looking at virulence is how many bacteria or viral particles it takes to cause the disease. What's the infectious dose? Some pathogens have very small infectious doses. Some of them you have to breathe or swallow a ton of cells or viruses in order for it to cause host. So there are different ways of thinking about measuring virulence. It is possible for pathogens to change over time because of genetic mutations. They can become more virulent, they could become less virulent, right? An attenuated strain is one that shows decreased virulence, right? Decreased ability to cause disease. And some of these are actually really useful for vaccines because you could put them in a person, for example, and they would have the antigenic profile similar to the virulent pathogen, but they wouldn't cause disease. Now, if you don't know what antigenic means, we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about the immune system. An avirulent strain is one that no longer causes disease at all. Those could also be useful for vaccine development. All right. All right, another term, carrier. A carrier is an individual who is infected with a pathogenic microbe, but never exhibits overt signs or symptoms of the disease. In other words, they're asymptomatic. This is a term that you've probably heard a lot in the context of COVID-19 because as many as 40%, 50% or more of the people who are infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus don't show any symptoms, but they can still infect other people, right? So they're asymptomatic. This used to be a concept that not as many people were familiar with, but now it seems to be in everyday usage. Used to have to talk about this using the example of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was a famous cook over 100 years ago who was infected with the bacteria that causes typhoid disease. And that's a very dangerous GI tract infection. And she herself never suffered from it as far as we know, but she was still shedding the bacteria and in the process of cooking, contaminating people's food. So many people over the years in places where she worked became infected. A number of them actually died. It took a while for the scientists at this time or doctors to figure this out because this was sort of still in the early days of understanding how bacteria cause disease. And so I'm going to put a link on here to a YouTube video about her story. It's actually a really interesting story for you to watch, but I'm not going to talk about it anymore right now. Anyway, that's who Typhoid Mary was. She was a perfect example of a carrier. Unfortunately, she was not willing to admit she was a carrier and thus continued to infect more people over time. All right, so just some of the actually, I'm going to stop this video right now and then we will pick up again with the next section.